For the first time since 2014, we are headed toward a non-Clemson entry into the ACC championship game. And for the first time since 2011, no Florida State or Clemson. Most likely, still some math to figure out, but NC State holds the division in its hands at this point, coming off a narrow win against Louisville. We got Cory Smith on the line from Pack Pride on 247 Sports to help us break it all down. Hey, Cory, how you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you, Mark?
I'm good. Appreciate you being here. Let's talk up some NC State football. Before we get to some issues on the defensive side and some stellar play from Devin Leary, let's just review this Louisville game and even take us back to Miami in regards to, I think we've come to a point in the season where most people would consider Pitt and NC State to be the two best teams in the conference, but they both trip up against Miami in the last 2 weeks, and NC State had kind of a narrow showing last weekend. So where do you think the team's at right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're in a much better place. You know, we've seen them do this earlier in the season. They've struggled a little bit on the road, which is why I think, you know, these next two games against Florida State and Wake Forest are going to be so critical for them, even though Wake Forest is in the same state. But it's still something they've struggled with so far this year. They did it earlier in the year against Mississippi State, where, you know, they came in confident against a team that they should beat. And they had an injury to Peyton Wilson. They lost that game. Same thing happened against Miami, where they had the injury to Isaiah Moore that we'll talk about in a little bit, but they responded with a loss in that one too. They've come back since in both of those games. After the Mississippi State game, they won 4 straight before losing to Miami. And now they go against a Louisville team this past weekend that they played, you know, extremely well against, both defensively and, you know, needed to wait basically 3 quarters before the offense showed up to the party. But, you know, they ended up winning a 28-13 game. And, you know, all 4 of the touchdowns were scored by NC State's offense. So it wasn't fluky in that sense. It was just, you know, they had to figure things out against Louisville for some reason.
Folks, please like the video, share these videos out on social media, because if you enjoy the content, others will as well. And follow Cory's work there at Pack Pride on 247 Sports as NC State vies for an ACC championship. A ton of recognizable guys on the offense. Emeka Emezi, Bam Knight, Ricky Person have been guys that have been productive for a few years now. But it all starts with Devin Leary. I find it interesting that, you know, in the last couple years, there's been a bit of a quarterback battle, and Bailey Hockman coming in from Florida State was the guy with all the accolades. He's transferred. And in recent weeks, there's been a lot of talk in the ACC and nationally about Kenny Pickett being a Heisman candidate. And we see Devin Leary with similar TD to pick ratio numbers. So maybe he plays himself into that race and probably should be getting a little bit more recognition than he is nationally.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think the issue for Devin Leary is the fact that, you know, NC State had some early losses. They had the Miami loss, and, you know, it wasn't necessarily because Devin Leary didn't play well in those games. It's because, you know, they just didn't put together a complete game in those. But all he's done over the last 6 weeks is throw for 18 touchdowns to 0 picks. He's also rushed for 2 additional touchdowns. So that's 20 total touchdowns he's accounted for to 0 interceptions. You know, and it's something that Dave Doran talked about earlier this week. He just said, you know, some guys have that, you know, that clutch gene. It's not necessarily that he's changing anything. It's that he doesn't change anything. He just goes out there and continues to do the same things that he's done all game long. And, you know, they changed the game plan a little bit at the end to be able to respond to some of the things that Louisville was doing this past weekend, to be able to put together those 3 touchdowns in the 4th quarter. And, you know, he just said, like, look, he's just a guy that doesn't lose his composure while other guys around him might, you know, and talking about the other team. And, you know, he's able to kind of put it all together. And once they get rolling in some of these games, it's hard to stop them. So they just have to, I think at this point now, the focus is getting started a little bit earlier. And then that way you can take some of the pressure off late and be able to, you know, go for some of those deep passes and put up some of those big yardage totals that, you know, guys like Kenny Pickett and others across the country have put up so far.
Folks, we were 13-5 against the spread last week, 107-69 against the spread. Please join us on Patreon to get my picks and also 20 media members right there. We got Cory Smith on the line from 247 Sports, Pack Pride, NC State, of course, gunning for an ACC Atlantic Division championship. And a lot of people are going to be watching NC State football that are just general college football fans that really haven't seen them play this season, that are going to get locked into this division race late. So before we hit the defense, Cory, just give us a take on the offense and what people need to look out for.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing with the offense, especially in the last several games, has been, as we just said, Devin Leary playing really well to this point. He's got a lot of playmakers around him, guys like Emeka Emezi, just caught a touchdown this past weekend against Louisville. Devin Carter has played well, did have a critical drop in the Miami game late there, but he's a guy that they've relied on all season long to make some of these big plays, like you saw against Clemson and the big play against Boston College. And somebody that's reliable in that offense too has been Thayer Thomas, slot receiver for NC State. I believe he already has a career high in touchdowns so far this season. So we'll look to him to see what he does the rest of the way. The big thing for NC State that they need to figure out at this point, they lost a guy in Chandler Zavala at left guard that was really critical for them in helping to be able to create some of those running lanes and get that running game going. They've struggled a little bit in the past 2 weeks since losing him and struggled a little bit against BC before that too. So we'll see exactly what they're able to do down the stretch. I know they're still trying to figure things out. They've got two really explosive backs that they just can't seem to break through with of these last few weeks. So that'll be something to watch, especially against Florida State this upcoming weekend, and then Wake Forest, and what's going to be a critical game where they're going to need all their playmakers to be able to perform.
If you check out either the traditional stats or the advanced metrics, it's one of the best defenses in the ACC, but there are some issues based on injuries.
Yeah, as I said before, you lose Peyton Wilson earlier in the season. They were kind of able to figure that out. They had a guy in Jalen Scott that stepped in, and another player in Levi Jones that's been, a versatile player for them. Originally committed to USC, transferred to NC State, but he wasn't being asked to do entirely too much. Then against Miami, they lose Isaiah Moore, who NC State's defensive coordinator Tony Gibson called earlier this season the heartbeat of NC State's defense. He was the middle linebacker. He was the guy who was leading in tackles for loss, leading in overall tackles, and playing his best football. Kind of looked at as, potential midseason ACC Player of the Year for the conference on the defensive side of the ball. They lose him, and then Drake Thomas this past weekend, a player that has been a vocal leader for NC State for the last several years. He had a huge game against Louisville, 15 tackles in that one, 2.5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, and a pass breakup. He won ACC Linebacker of the Week this past week for that performance. And now he's moving over to the middle linebacker, which is his more natural position. So we'll get to see him play and be a leader on this field. And now Levi Jones actually had a really good week this past week too. Didn't end up with a sack, but had 3 quarterback pressures and kept Malik Cunningham on his heels all night long. So that linebacker core has been a little bit depleted, but it's still a strength of this team and helping that front seven and helping the coverage to be able to create too.
Yeah, Drake Thomas leading the team with 68 tackles, 2 picks, 4 sacks. NC State taking on Florida State in Tallahassee this weekend, coming off a win against Louisville. We got Cory Smith on the line from Pack Pride, so join him and the rest of the staff right there covering North Carolina State on 247 Sports. Florida State at one point this season, 3 to 4 weeks into the season, looked like arguably the worst team in the conference. Now they've picked it up, win against North Carolina, beat Syracuse, who's actually Syracuse has turned out to be a pretty decent team, and played one down to the wire against Clemson. Your thoughts about Florida State, the matchup, concerns, or where NC State could take advantage?
Yeah, I mean, with Florida State, you're always concerned because they've always recruited well. The talent hasn't always been there in terms of being able to put it all together on the field, but they have some really good players. And I think the concern for NC State is being able to stop the run again this weekend. They've been one of the better or better run stopping teams in the country on the season. But when you look at what this team has with Jayshon Corbin, but also Treshaun Ward, and then Jordan Travis, obviously being a mobile quarterback, for NC State, they're going to have to be able to stop this ground game that's averaging almost 210 yards per game, which is number 2 in the ACC. So for NC State, they're going to have to do that again. And then on the offensive end, be able to find a way to limit Jermaine Johnson, who's been, since transferring into Florida State, has been one of the best defensive players in the ACC so far this season, despite the overall record for Florida State. So, they have to be able to get their running game going and be able to stop Florida State's running game, because we know that the passing offense for NC State can find success, but they have to be able to get a more balanced offense against Florida State to be able to control the ball and be able to win this game.
Cory, let me ask you about Dave Doeren and the program. From an outside perspective, a guy that just watches college football across the board, there's a number of programs in the ACC that you would put in a collection, whether that's NC State, Pitt, Louisville, North Carolina, as teams that typically go to bowl games, may have a breakout year if things cycle up in terms of the talent and the upperclassmen, and maybe the schedule gives you a break. That may contend for a division championship. Obviously, you've had to deal with Clemson year to year, and the Coastal Division has not, or you may have played in a couple conference championship games. I've been a little critical of Dave Doeren, I will admit, in the past, because prior to last season, at one point he had like one win against a ranked team in like 17 or 18 games. Of course, he's been around since 2013. 12 or 13.
Yep, 2013.
And at one point, again, going into last season, I think the win percentage in conference was 38% going into 2020. And I'm looking at this program thinking this is just a formula where basically they go 3-5 in the ACC. They play a week 9 conference schedule unless the ACC forces Notre Dame on NC State that particular year. Now, I know they've picked up some better teams, West Virginia and others here recently, and that's the formula for your 6-6, 7-5 team that goes on to a bowl game. Don't they expect to do better than this? Voila, 8-3 last year before a bowl loss, and here they are contending for a division championship. So just your assessment on Dave Doeren, the state of the program, and what the fan base expects.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for Dave Doeren, he's been building towards this year and really next year, if he keeps a lot of the same pieces that he has. I think, the hope was to keep guys like Aleem McNeil, who went to the NFL this past year. And you'd like to keep a lot of the pieces that you have this year for next year's team too. But, the opportunity they were waiting for was finally beating Clemson. Obviously Clemson is not the Clemson of old. And I say of old, like they weren't good last year. I mean, they've been good for several years now, but you beat a Clemson team. They're down now at this point. And so for NC State, they need to be able to, seize this opportunity. I think there was a lot of NC State fans who were upset about the Miami loss initially, and saying, oh, well, this is further proof that they're out of it. They're not going to get, to the ACC championship game. But, I think a lot of fans now at this point are looking at it and saying, all right, beat Florida State this coming up weekend, find a way to do that, regardless of how you come out in that one, and then go into Wake Forest. And if you can find a way to win that game, then you set yourself up to be, the top team in the ACC Atlantic. And, I think for any NC State fan that was going into this year, they were looking at it and saying, all right, we're going to be second fiddle to Clemson again. Just finish second. Now the expectations have shifted because of how good they've had, how good of a season they put together this year and how they've set themselves up. So, I don't want to temper expectations, because I do feel like they have a chance to still win the ACC. But now at this point, I think, NC State fans are looking at it and going, oh, well, you've got to win it. You've got to do it now, because if you don't, then you never will. So there's a lot of expectations going into these next couple weeks for NC State. And it doesn't really slow down after that, because then they have to play UNC to close out the year. And regardless of how good or bad UNC is, it's always going to be a tough game to play.
Cory Smith, Pack Pride, 247 Sports, helping us out on NC State as the Wolfpack takes on Florida State in Tallahassee this weekend.